Merry Christmas. We regret to inform you that your position has been eliminated. That sentence sounds like a bad joke, a dark meme, something you'd expect to see on social media for shock value. But for hundreds of thousands of Americans this year, it was a real message delivered days before Thanksgiving or just weeks before Christmas. We tend to think of layoffs as something that happens quietly after the holidays, after the year-end reports are filed, after the bonuses are paid. But that assumption no longer holds. In 2025, layoffs are no longer waiting for January. They are happening right in the middle of the most expensive, emotionally charged time of the year when heating bills rise, travel costs spike, and families are already stretched thin. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This isn't random. It's not bad luck. And it's not limited to one industry. More than 1 million jobs have already been cut this year, marking the most aggressive wave of layoffs since the pandemic era. And increasingly, companies aren't even trying to hide it. So the real question isn't whether layoffs are happening. It's why they're re-accelerating during the holidays and what that tells us about where the job market is heading next. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these layoffs aren't accidental and why they may only be the beginning. If these layoffs were isolated incidents, the stories would sound different. Different industries, different timing, different explanations, but they don't. Instead, the same details keep showing up over and over again, almost word for word. 2 weeks before Christmas, a week before Thanksgiving, no warning, no severance, no time to prepare. People describe waking up to an unexpected calendar invite from HR 10 minutes notice, a vague meeting title, and that sinking feeling in your stomach before the call even starts because deep down you already know. For some, it happened right after they uprooted their lives. They moved across state lines. Some even crossed borders, new city, new rent, new cost of living, and then within months, sometimes weeks, the job disappears. Others describe losing not just their income, but everything tied to it. No payout for unused paid time off. Health insurance ending immediately. Retirement plans frozen. Projects approved 1 month declared no longer valuable the next. What's striking isn't just the volume of these stories. It's how similar they sound. Regardless of age, location, or profession, you see nurses laid off after years of service. Tech workers replaced by automation. Factory employees watching entire production lines shut down. Workers in their late 60s being pushed out just before retirement eligibility. In many households, it's not just one job lost. Spouses are being laid off within weeks of each other. Dual-income families suddenly drop to zero income during the most expensive time of the year. And when people start sending out applications, reality hits even harder. Hundreds of resumes submitted, multiple interview rounds, final stage rejections, or worse, silence. At some point, it becomes impossible to call this bad luck when thousands of people across different sectors and countries are describing the same experience with the same language and the same outcomes. You're no longer looking at individual failure. You're looking at a system under stress. And that's the moment when anecdotal evidence turns into something more powerful, a warning sign. Because personal stories don't pile up like this unless something deeper is happening underneath the surface. And to understand just how serious that underlying problem is, we need to stop listening for a moment and start looking at the data. Once you step away from individual stories and look at the numbers, the picture doesn't get calmer, it gets clearer. On paper, the job market still looks mixed. Some months show gains. Headlines highlight resilience, and official statements continue to emphasize stability. But trends matter far more than isolated data points. In the past 6 months alone, job losses have appeared repeatedly, not just once, but several times. October was especially brutal with more than 100,000 jobs disappearing in a single month. November technically showed job growth, but it was weak, uneven, and heavily concentrated in a narrow set of roles. That's the key detail many people miss. A labor market doesn't need to collapse outright to cause widespread pain. It only needs to stop absorbing workers fast enough, and that's exactly what's happening. Another critical factor is revisions. Initial job reports are rarely the final story. Over time, numbers are quietly adjusted, often downward. When early data already looks bad, history suggests the final picture usually ends up worse. So when official figures admit to significant losses, the question becomes uncomfortable. How much damage isn't being fully captured yet? Looking at the year as a whole makes the trend even harder to ignore. Nearly 1.2 million layoffs have been announced, marking the highest level since the pandemic shock years. This isn't a short-term correction or a localized downturn. It's a broad-based slowdown affecting multiple sectors at once, and unlike previous cycles, this one is unfolding. While the cost of living remains elevated, rent hasn't meaningfully come down for most households. Energy and heating costs remain high. Healthcare premiums continue to rise. So even workers who technically still have jobs feel increasingly exposed. A single layoff isn't just a setback, it's a financial cliff. What makes this period especially dangerous is the gap between perception and reality. People are told the job market is fine, even as their personal experience tells a different story. That disconnect erodes confidence, freezes spending, and quietly tightens financial behavior across the economy. In other words, fear itself becomes an economic force. And when fear spreads, companies react not by hiring, but by cutting risk. They pause expansion. They delay recruitment. They trim payrolls preemptively. Which brings us to the next problem. Because this slowdown isn't confined to one industry. It's spreading from offices to factories, from software to assembly lines. And once that happens, layoffs stop being cyclical and start becoming structural. Overhiring, easy money, cheap capital, a correction that was supposedly contained to one corner of the economy. That narrative no longer holds. Yes, the tech sector was hit first and hardest, but it didn't stop there. In technology, the explanation is often the same. Restructuring efficiency automation roles are eliminated not because workers failed, but because companies claim the role itself no longer justifies its cost. In many cases, those same positions quietly reappear months later, rebranded and reposted with lower pay and broader responsibilities. Artificial intelligence plays a role here, but not always in the way it's advertised. AI isn't just replacing tasks. It's giving companies justification, a reason to cut headcount now, experiment later, and figure out the human cost after the fact. But the deeper shift becomes obvious when layoffs spill beyond office jobs. Manufacturing and logistics have begun to feel the pressure as well. Factories are reducing shifts. Production schedules are being cut back. Entire plants are shutting down in certain regions, even as others operate on skeleton crews. When output slows, labor is one of the first expenses to be trimmed. And then there's the auto industry, a perfect case study of how economic strain travels upstream. Vehicle prices have climbed far faster than wages over the past few years. Quality complaints are rising. Financing costs are higher. For many middle-class households, buying a new car is no longer realistic. Not because they don't want one, but because they simply can't afford it. When cars stop selling, factories don't keep running at full capacity. When factories slow down, workers are sent home. And when workers lose income, local economies weaken almost immediately. This is how layoffs multiply. It's not just about one company protecting margins. It's about an entire chain reacting to shrinking demand. What's especially dangerous is how quickly this turns into a feedback loop. Laid-off workers spend less. Lower spending hurts business revenue. Weaker revenue leads to more layoffs. And suddenly a cost-cutting measure becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. At that point, the most important question isn't how many jobs were lost last month. It's who's left to buy what companies are still trying to sell. Because no matter how advanced the technology becomes, no economy functions without consumers. And consumers don't exist without paychecks, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if these layoffs aren't a response to slowing demand but a contributor to it? And if that's the case, then the timing of these cuts starts to matter even more, especially when they're happening right before the holidays. On the surface, holiday layoffs feel cruel, cold, tone-deaf, almost deliberately inhumane. But from a corporate perspective, the timing isn't accidental at all. In fact, for companies focused purely on numbers, the end of the year is the most convenient moment to cut. First, there's the accounting incentive. Layoffs before year-end clean up the books. They reduce payroll obligations going into the next fiscal year. They make balance sheets look leaner for investors and analysts reviewing performance. Severance costs, if they're offered at all, are often lower when cuts are framed as restructuring rather than performance-based terminations. Then there's the benefit reset. By eliminating roles now and rehiring later, companies quietly reset salary expectations. Workers returning to the market after months of unemployment are far more likely to accept lower pay, fewer benefits, and worse terms than they would during a strong hiring cycle. But the most powerful reason is psychological. During the holidays, workers are at their most vulnerable. They're distracted by family obligations. They're less likely to job hop. They're less willing to challenge decisions or negotiate aggressively. A layoff in March triggers anger. A layoff in December triggers shock and silence. People don't immediately protest. They don't immediately file complaints. They go home and worry about rent gifts, travel plans, and heating bills. Survival mode kicks in. That's not an accident. It's leverage. There's also a social pressure at play. Being laid off during the holidays carries a stigma that many people internalize. Instead of pushing back, they withdraw. They tell fewer people. They absorb the blame themselves. And for the workers who remain, the message is unmistakable. If it can happen now at the worst possible time, it can happen anytime. That fear changes behavior instantly. Employees work longer hours. They complain less. They accept frozen wages and canceled bonuses without protest. Productivity may rise in the short term, but trust erodes quietly underneath. This is how layoffs stop being a temporary adjustment and start becoming a management strategy. Not because it's humane, not because it's sustainable, but because in the short term, it works. And yet the damage doesn't end when the termination emails are sent. Because layoffs don't just affect the people who leave. They fundamentally change the lives of the people who stay. Layoffs are often framed as an ending. But for many workers, they're just the beginning of a different kind of pressure. When a round of cuts is over, the people who remain are expected to feel grateful, relieved, lucky. In reality, most feel something else entirely. Fear. They watch colleagues disappear overnight. Desks emptied, calendars wiped clean, and they're left asking the same question every morning. Why not me? That uncertainty changes everything. Workloads don't shrink when teams do. Responsibilities are redistributed. Deadlines stay the same and expectations quietly rise. One person is now doing the work of two, sometimes three, without additional pay or guarantees. This is the skeleton crew phase. Employees stay late. They answer emails faster. They stop pushing back. Pay freezes and bonus cancellations are accepted with forced smiles because the alternative feels worse. In a weak job market, compliance becomes a survival strategy. But there's a deeper cost that doesn't show up on spreadsheets. Trust breaks down. When companies announce layoffs due to budget constraints and then host lavish holiday parties or invest millions into office upgrades, the message is clear, even if it's never spoken aloud. Optics matter more than people. For remaining employees, that contradiction is impossible to ignore. Team culture deteriorates. Collaboration becomes guarded. People stop sharing ideas, stop taking risks, and stop believing long-term promises. Why plan a future at a company that just proved how disposable you are? And yet, management often interprets this silence as stability. Productivity numbers may hold temporarily. Meetings continue. Deadlines are met. From the outside, everything appears functional, but beneath the surface, engagement erodes. Workers mentally detach. They stop seeing their job as a career and start seeing it as a placeholder. Loyalty becomes transactional the moment another option appears, even a slightly better one, they leave. In that sense, layoffs don't just reduce headcount. They hollow out organizations from the inside. And while companies may view this as a necessary sacrifice for efficiency, it creates a workforce that is exhausted, anxious, and constantly bracing for the next cut. Which brings us to another layer of this story, one that's quietly reshaping how people search for work and how hope itself is being sold. Artificial intelligence is often presented as the headline reason behind modern layoffs. And in some cases that's true. Companies openly admit that roles are being eliminated, because software can now do the work faster, cheaper, and without benefits. Tens of thousands of positions have already been cut with AI listed as a direct or contributing factor. But focusing only on technology misses the larger point. AI isn't just replacing workers. It's changing how companies justify decisions they were already inclined to make. When budgets tighten, automation becomes a convenient explanation. It reframes cost-cutting as innovation and positions layoffs as progress rather than desperation. The human impact becomes secondary to the narrative. At the same time, job seekers are running into another problem, one that feels almost cruel in its own way: fake job postings. Companies continue to post openings that don't meaningfully exist. Sometimes it's to signal growth to investors. Sometimes it's to collect resumes for the future. Sometimes it's simply to create the illusion that hiring is ongoing, even when internal freezes are firmly in place. For people desperately searching for work, these postings offer false hope. Hundreds of applications go out, automated rejections come back, or nothing at all. Interviews stretch across multiple rounds only to end with vague explanations or sudden silence. This environment has created a new market entirely, the business of hope. Social media is now flooded with tools, courses, and platforms promising to beat the system. AI-powered resume writers, one-click application services, programs that claim to send out hundreds of applications on your behalf. The marketing is subtle, relatable faces, familiar frustrations. The message is always the same. You're not failing. You're just using the wrong tool. But when the underlying problem is a shortage of real jobs, no amount of optimization can fix it. In a weak labor market, hope becomes a product. And desperation makes people buy. This doesn't mean technology is evil or that every tool is a scam. But it does mean job seekers are being asked to navigate an increasingly distorted landscape, one where effort doesn't reliably translate into opportunity. And when that disconnect grows wide enough, frustration turns into something more dangerous: disillusionment. Which leads us to the biggest question of all, one that companies, policymakers, and executives seem reluctant to confront directly. At some point, the conversation around layoffs runs into a wall. Companies talk about efficiency. Executives talk about innovation. Investors talk about margins. But there's one question almost no one wants to confront directly. If millions of people are losing their jobs or living in constant fear of losing them, who is supposed to keep the economy running? An economy doesn't survive on balance sheets alone. It survives on consumers, and consumers need income. When layoffs spread across multiple sectors at once, the impact compounds. It's not just lost wages. It's delayed purchases, canceled plans, smaller grocery runs, older cars kept on the road longer, vacations skipped, homes not bought. Each individual decision seems small. Together, they reshape demand. And once demand weakens, companies face a paradox of their own making. They cut workers to protect profits, then struggle to sell products because fewer people can afford them. We're already seeing early signs of this tension. Inventory builds up, promotions become more aggressive. Financing terms stretch further. Meanwhile, workers remain cautious even if they're still employed. Fear alone is enough to change behavior. This is what makes the current moment so fragile. It's not a classic recession with a single trigger. It's a slow erosion of confidence. Businesses pull back because they expect consumers to pull back. Consumers pull back because they expect businesses to cut more jobs. And once that loop takes hold, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Historically, labor markets don't heal overnight. When layoffs accelerate late in the year, the effects often bleed into the next one. Hiring freezes linger. Wages stay pressured. Job searches take longer. That's why the timing of these holiday layoffs matters so much. They're not just a year-end cleanup. They're a signal. A signal that many companies are bracing for a future that looks weaker than they're willing to admit publicly. And if that signal is accurate, then the real consequences of today's layoffs haven't even fully arrived yet. The rise of holiday layoffs 2000 Daisy 2025 isn't just about bad timing or corporate insensitivity. It reflects a deeper shift in how companies are responding to uncertainty and how fragile the U.S. job market slowdown has quietly become. Layoffs are accelerating. They're spreading across industries and they're happening earlier than most people expect. This doesn't mean panic is the right response, but denial isn't either. Understanding the patterns matters whether you're employed job hunting or simply trying to plan your next move in an increasingly unstable environment. The more clearly you see the landscape, the harder it is to be blindsided by it. So the real question now isn't whether things will change. It's how prepared you'll be when they do. If this breakdown helped you see the job market more clearly, subscribe so you're not caught off guard by what comes.